So without further ado, I'm delighted to introduce our speaker for tonight. He is a leader in the field of developmental psychopathology, particularly ADHD. He is a professor at UCSF and UC Berkeley, and edits the Psychological Bulletin, which is the most cited journal in all of psychology. He has also written several books, numerous articles. We actually have a limited number of copies of his latest book called The ADHD Explosion in the back. If anybody wishes to purchase Rashmi, she would be the person who has the books. If you would like, you can get it signed tonight, maybe. Right. So he's also been interviewed by Time Magazine, USA Today, the New York Times, among other publications, and has appeared on the Today Show, Good Morning America. Basically, a pretty solid expert in ADHD. So let's give a warm welcome tonight to Dr. Stephen Hinshaw.
Okay, I'm going to be off to the side because if I stand in the middle, I'll be right in front of the slides. And the goal tonight is for me to restrain myself, which is hard to do because I could talk till about midnight, but I'm going to try to go for maybe a little over an hour and go slow enough that there's questions during and after, and the main goal is to have you think. Okay, we're going to start right in after that little delay. And as you know, when that alarm sounds, the squad has to come, so they can make it quicker than they might have. So, what is ADHD? It's not one thing, it's many things, but it's in the news. We learned 4 years ago that ADHD is caused by SpongeBob SquarePants. This is the kind of stuff we get in the media. This was actually a really good study done by Angelina Lillard of Virginia, who went to a preschool and randomly assigned 4-year-olds to watch 9 minutes of SpongeBob, 9 minutes for another group of a public television nature show, or third group, 9 minutes of free play. And immediately afterwards, the kids got a little test battery of attention and inhibition and executive function. And guess who tanked it? The kids who just watched SpongeBob. It was actually Patrick. It wasn't SpongeBob. They isolated this and no SpongeBob. So maybe our fast-paced media aren't very good for everybody's attention. But to say this, and this is a very good study, but the headlines were this is the cause of ADHD. Simply not true. A lot of data that if you have a kindergartner born just before that cutoff in the district, starts kindergarten at 4 versus a day or 2 afterwards and waits a year to start at 5, that makes a big difference because it's about a 35% greater chance that those young ones will go to special ed and get a diagnosis of ADHD. So maybe ADHD is just immaturity. Stay awake, as if you weren't already from the alarm, but continue to, because we'll learn that maybe at the level of our cortex in our brain, ADHD is a matter of immaturity. Medications get a lot of bad press. Obviously, they can be helpful. They're not a cure. Do they cause heart attacks? Are they the cause of substance abuse? The data are not very convincing that they are, but it's in the headlines. They're pretty scary. And if you read the New York Times, I'm going to do it very quickly, over the last couple of years, the op-eds and the opinion pieces, very good about PTSD and bipolar disorder and depression, and very stigmatizing about ADHD. Someone on the editorial board of the New York Times has had a kid or a relative overdiagnosed and treated with medicine that didn't work well, because the level of the opinion pieces is kind of in the dark ages. We don't talk that way about most other mental disorders, but it's still okay about ADHD. So, at the same time, the rates of diagnosis are going up so fast these days in the United States that it's almost as though the very poor practices we have in too many general pediatricians' offices of a quick diagnosis, it's almost as though we're kind of bringing it on ourselves because we're not taking the time to do it right. So let's go to the next slide. Down. So what's the fact? ADHD is a neurodevelopmental disorder, as we'll talk about. Biology and brains and genes have a lot to do with why some people display this. It costs a lot, about $100 billion to the economy last year for kids, not just for treatment, but for special ed and juvenile justice. And for adults, about $200 billion lost to the economy, mainly because of underemployment, unemployment, and a lot of related conditions in adulthood. When did ADHD start? When did people start writing about it? Around the same time that we started to make kids go to school. So maybe when the culture changes and we make every kid learn to read and every kid sit still, that reveals the underlying biological propensity in a small subgroup of kids. That's probably true. But it means that ADHD has a biological set of origins. But when we change our culture, we uncover it, we unearth it. A lot of people talk about ADHD as a hidden gift. We should never treat it. We should just let that natural creativity come about. Ned Hollowell, in Driven to Distraction, in his later books, said something pretty eloquent. He said, if ADHD is a gift, it's really hard to unwrap that gift. It takes a lot of work. CEOs with ADHD, some of them create personal assistants. They've got ways of buying executive function that a lot of people with ADHD don't. So let's go to the next slide. One of the myths is that medicines are just terrible, you should never take them, they poison your brain. We'll have more to say about that a little bit later. But the other myth is that once you give a kid or adolescent or adult medication, they're fine. They don't need any other treatment. That is rarely the case. Pills don't teach skills. It's sort of a silly adage, but it's true. You need to learn a lot of competencies that the medication might prepare your brain to learn better. And the biggest myth isn't to diagnose ADHD. Just spend 10 minutes in your pediatrician's office, or if you're an adult, 10 minutes in your general practitioner's office. Unfortunately, that's the standard today in the United States. And that's why we miss it some of the time, and why we overdose diagnosis some of the time too. So next slide, I'm going to go quick. Question?
What is it, neuroprotective?
Neuroprotective. Maybe the medicines actually protect your brain the way that SSRIs protect your brain if you have depression. If you have depression...
And that, you're saying that's a myth, right?
No, the myth is that they poison your brain. Neuroprotection may be a possibility. We'll talk about that. Okay, so we're going to spend a couple minutes looking at medication ads. Now, I don't work for pharma. I'm not trying to sell you anything. The reason I can do this is something called fair use. If a researcher or a scholar wants to talk about a topic and look at, say, advertisements without, in my pocket here is a pharma contract, I can do so if I try to present a balance. So, this is an ad for Concerta. Concerta was the first long-acting form of methylphenidate or Ritalin. It came out 15 years ago. And for the first time, the company spent a long time doing this, they invented a form of Ritalin, it's just regular old Ritalin, in a little contraption that squirts it out over 8, 10, 12 hours. They said 12, it doesn't last that long in many cases. Became a big seller because you didn't have to give a second dose in the noon or a third dose in the afternoon. But look at this ad. So, smiling mother, smiling son, and if Jason takes his medicine, the mother, and by definition the whole family, sees Jason, not his symptoms. They see the real kid. Now, I'm very interested in what's called the stigma of mental illness. Why it's still the last thing you'd ever want to have. We've done a lot about gay marriage in our society in the last 20 years, a lot about racial prejudice, long way to go. Mental illness is still a lot of jokes. It's still underfunded. So this is a very interesting ad. The ad says, if you read between the lines, if you medicate your kid, you remove the stigma. You see the real child, not just these symptoms. So it's very powerful, whether true or not, very powerful. Let's go to the next slide. What's the big market today? ADHD in adults for medications. The market for kids has reached its peak. If you get diagnosed with ADHD and you're a kid in this country, about 2/3 of the time you're going to get medicated. And that's been flat for about the last 10 years. But the biggest growing market is teens and adults, and the biggest growing market there is adult women. So look at this ad. Now, unless you've got really good vision, better than mine, if you can't see some of the fine print, there are citations to the literature here. There's psychiatric articles about if you have ADHD as an adult, you're about twice as likely to get divorced as the next person. And you're likely to have what's called a comorbidity, an accompanying disorder of major depression. So if you take medication, you won't get divorced and you won't get depressed. That's the statement of the ad. Maybe it's true, but it's a powerful statement. And this is where the hot button issues are with adult diagnosis. Now we're going to go to the third one that's not in your handout, because this is about a 10 megabyte slide that I couldn't send ahead of time. It was this. Baseball fan Shane Victorino, the first Hawaiian American to play Major League Baseball, World Series ring with the Phillies a few years ago, and the Red Sox a year ago, and then the Red Sox in last place this past year. He got traded again. Really good player, handsome guy, family, and he says, it's cut off over here, I didn't outgrow my ADHD, that's why I'm telling my story. So why is he telling his story? Because he's trying to reduce the stigma and because he can take stimulants when he plays ball. The only reason he can take stimulants when he plays ball is that he's got a prescription from a doctor because he has ADHD. Because if you didn't, you would be like taking steroids. It gives you a performance edge. Stimulants improve your reaction time. So here's the controversy. 3 times more Major League Baseball players get exemptions for stimulants than Major League football or basketball players. Because baseball is a really boring sport. 3 hours in the 9th inning, and you're about to pass out, but that line drive is coming, you got to be alert right now. Or is that a changeup or a curve coming over? You got to be alert right now. So are people gaming the system? Are we getting a performance edge by taking these meds? Or is it really true that Shane probably does, I've never seen this evaluation, has ADHD? But ADHD is now synonymous with getting a performance edge because the medicines you take, they give you that edge. And we'll talk about that too. Okay, next slide. I mentioned these costs. ADHD is costly if you're a student in school and if you're trying to get a job or stay with a job. ADHD is costly to your peer group and peer relationships because if you have ADHD, you tend to blow out the birthday candles that it wasn't your birthday party. It was you didn't read that cue, it smelled so good, and you didn't restrain the impulse, and kids don't like that. Kids' attitudes about you are very predictive of a lot of outcomes later in life. So it's not just making a kid more inattentive or less impulsive, but we've got to teach social skills. Families don't cause ADHD by their parenting, but families get locked into negative styles of parenting with their kids with ADHD, and it's gasoline on the fire. It's also true that if you're very young with ADHD, you're likely to get hit by a car or swallow poisons. And if you're over 16, you're 5 times more likely to have a motor vehicle accident if you have ADHD. So it's not just fidgety, squirmy, bothersome behavior. There's serious consequences. We'll go to the next. I'm going fast. We got delayed. Okay, so now we're for our assessment workshop. And there's way too many words on this slide. This will take us from our 10 p.m. to midnight session for all of you staying on. You have to document a certain number of symptoms of inattentiveness, a certain number of symptoms of impulsive and hyperactive behavior. They've got to be present pretty much every day for at least 6 months. They had to have occurred or at least started before you were 12. They've got to be present at school and at home if you're a kid, or at home and on the job if you're an adult. Otherwise, maybe it's just a lousy classroom or really just dysfunctional parenting. And you've got to rule out other conditions. And you might have to make sure that the kid actually wasn't abused, because maybe that's what's leading to the symptoms. And you have to do a workup to see that it's really not a seizure disorder, because some seizures look just like the inattentive form of ADHD. And you think you can do that in 10 minutes? So we get funded by federal grants for our studies at Berkeley. 8 to 10 hours is our minimum assessment. No doctor can afford that or get reimbursed for it, but you've got to spend an hour or 2 minimum. Even if doctors are trained to do that and want to do it, they don't get reimbursed for it. So we're all paying the price for the family's concerned, sees their pediatrician. Gee, I read about ADHD, didn't really learn about a bunch of med school, but I know about it now. She sounds fidgety to me, prescription, and that's some of the mess we're in right now. Next slide. Question?
Is that inattentive or hyperactive? Because a lot of times with the girls, especially with the girls, it seems like we're seeing inattention without hyperactivity, so it's not getting that good.
Right, so I'm going fast. If you've got a bunch of these inattentive and disorganized symptoms, but you're not terribly impulsive or hyperactive, you might have what used to be called ADD without hyperactivity. We call it now the inattentive form of ADHD. That girls are more likely to have than boys. Still, most girls who are referred are pretty hyperactive too. If you've got only hyperactivity and no inattention, you're probably 4 years of age. And that's who gets diagnosed with that. But most of those kids graduate to what we call the combined type. You've got the combination of inattention and hyperactivity and impulsivity. Once first grade starts, then the inattention starts to show. Boys are more likely to be hyperactive and ornery. Girls are more likely to be purely inattentive, but there's big exceptions either way. So what is ADHD? I can't really spend any time on this because of our late start. Maybe it really is an attention deficit, but there's a lot of different kinds of attention. Scientists still don't really know if ADHD is truly an attention disorder, or is it an inhibitory disorder? This is Russ Barkley's theory for the last 18 years. It's the burning wax and the smoke. It's going to feel so good to get those. Oh, it wasn't my birth. I didn't remember to inhibit my impulse to blow out the candles. So if you can't inhibit it, you're never going to get a chance to pay attention. You're never going to get a chance to show these other, what we call executive functions of planning and correcting their errors. Or maybe ADHD is somewhat cognitive and attentional and somewhat inhibitory, but it has a lot to do with reward. What do most kids have to learn to do in public school? Work for this unbelievable delayed reward called honor roll 4 or 5 months later. And the kid with ADHD says, 4 or 5 months later, I'm worried about the end of this period. Are you kidding me? It's hard for such individuals, probably because of some brain wiring and the way dopamine works, to really get a sense of intrinsic motivation to work for delayed goals. If you're always a little bit drowsy, you'll fidget. If you're always a little bit preoccupied with the immediate, you won't get that sense of it really takes one step in front of another for a long time. So imagine some people with ADHD may have a sort of purely attentional problem, others the inhibitory problems, others, but it's an overlapping Venn diagram, motivational and intrinsic reward problems too. So what we call ADHD is at least 3, if not maybe 13 or 30 different things. This is what the science is really trying to figure out. We're going to go to the next slide. We're going to go to the next slide. We don't have time to look at brains right now. One more, and one more. So Phil Shaw, colleague of ours who works in Bethesda at the National Institutes of Health, started about 10 years ago this incredible study. They started with a normative group of kids, and then they got a big sample of 237 kids with ADHD, and they bring them back every year or two to lie down flat in the brain scanner. So this is good old structural MRI, just like a super sharp X-ray. It's not functional. It's not looking where the blood is flowing. Just a really sharp picture. So they have pictures of kids' brains at age 6, and then 7.5, and then 9, and the study's gone on into adolescence and even early adulthood now. In the normative part of the study, they learned that the cortex, biology folks, what's your cortex? The gray matter, the little coating on the outer of your brain, it's about that thick. There's a cubic, you know what a cubic millimeter is? Think of a millimeter ruler. So it's a little box, right? A millimeter by a millimeter by a millimeter. How many neurons lie in a cubic millimeter of cortex? 50 million. The brain is the densely packed thing in the universe that we've ever discovered. If you're a little kid, your cortex is really kind of too thick and too fat, like prunes when you're 2, 3, and 4. Thickens up again right about 6, 6.5. Kind of interesting that way before brain scanning, way many generations ago, people said, no, this kid's 6, well, it's time for them to get in school, right? We sort of followed the trends in brain development. What happens for kids with ADHD when they got this sample in? Their brains did not reach the maximal thickness in the cortex, especially right here in the frontal lobes, until they were 9.5. 3.5-year delay. They're trying like mad now to figure out why. Is it certain genes? Was it prenatal experiences? Was it some combination? And of course, people said when this first came out, well, 3.5-year delay, they'll catch up by adolescence. What happens during adolescence? Your cortex thins again, it prunes again, it gets more efficient, and the kids with ADHD are still 3 to 4 years behind. So there's some program in the brain, in the genes, and the environment, or all three, that's leading to an immature brain pattern in many people with ADHD. So remember this sort of immaturity that 4-year-olds get diagnosed too early. Maybe there really is a sort of neural immaturity for at least a subset of people with ADHD. Let's go to the next. Have to go quickly. Do genes matter for this? Yes, a lot. 80% of the liability for ADHD is in our genes, not in our child-rearing patterns. That's higher than the liability for schizophrenia. It's almost as high as it is for autism or bipolar disorder. But that doesn't mean, oh, you're born with these rotten genes and you've got ADHD and there's nothing you can do about it. You can have completely genetic conditions, some rare neurological disorders, and you give the right diet, right medicine, or the right schooling, and you can really eliminate the symptoms. So ADHD is caused a lot by a number of genes. We're trying to discover what they are, but that doesn't mean that biology and genes are the only way you can treat it. Next. Quickly, if you're born prematurely and at a low weight, or a very low weight, or what's called an extremely low weight, extremely low birth weight is under 1 kilo, so it's under 2.2 pounds. And of course, those kids never survived 30 years ago, and now they do because of neonatal intensive care units. What if you're born at these very low weights? ADHD, Tourette's, cerebral palsy, some forms of intellectual disability. The brain starts to get bled into if you're born too early and too low a weight. So it's not a genetic factor, but it's a biological factor. If your mom drank too much during pregnancy and drank way too much, you will get fetal alcohol syndrome. Your face looks different. You have an intellectual disability. Your IQ is below 70. Extreme behavior problems. But what if your mom drank just a little bit, or only binged once or twice, not 5 times? You're born with what are called, you're likely to be born with what are called fetal alcohol effects. And what are fetal alcohol effects? Inattention, impulsivity, hyperactivity, and learning problems. So over and above any genetic risk, alcohol when you're developing in utero, and tobacco and nicotine when you're developing in utero trigger ADHD as well. So early biology as well as early genes. If you're born and your parents don't necessarily abuse you, but don't form the closest bonds with you, and insecure attachment, that predicts depression later on. That predicts aggressive behavior later on. That does not predict later ADHD. ADHD seems to be more biologically wired in, but if you have a really not very giving family for whatever reasons, you might get other conditions on top of it. Next. We're going fast. So if you want some fancy words to impress your friends, equifinality. Outcome X, that's ADHD. For some kids, it's the genes they're born with. For some kids, it's maternal alcohol or smoke. For other kids, it might be, if you were born in Romania 30 years ago in one of those horrible orphanages, one of the leading outcomes of that terrible deprivation is ADHD symptoms. There's a lot of different pathways that might lead to ADHD. And if you've got the symptoms, that doesn't mean everybody comes out the same. Multifinality, you might have a very good or very poor outcome depending on a whole lot of factors, including whether you get treatment. Next. Parenting is not the cause because the symptoms appear often very early and they're linked to these genes. But how would you like to be the parent of a kid who gave up naps at about 12 months and is up about 5 every morning tearing down the curtains in the living room and got thrown out of 3 preschools? And now you're struggling for what the right placement is in district or out of district. What's the matter with us as parents? We must have caused it. Why does the kid argue about everything? Why is the kid, we say these directions 50 times, they never seem to get it. It's frustrating, and parents naturally tend to fight fire with fire, and now you've got a vicious cycle. The parenting doesn't have to be the cause, but it could help maintain the problem. We have way too much on this slide to talk about. We're going to go to the next. Because we got a late start with that horrible beeping sound. If you're interested in the research side of things, Gordon Harold, who's from the UK, I was just in Philadelphia last week. I was at a conference, presented not with him, but heard him talk. Huge adoption study in England. So why adoption study? That's pretty important. Because the kids aren't related to their adoptive parents. In this big adoption sample of over 500 kids, a lot of the kids, not all, but some had ADHD. They tended to piss their parents off, and their parents responded with really negative parenting. And that negative parenting, 5 years later, predicted the maintenance of their ADHD symptoms. And this occurred in families where there's no relationship biologically between a parent and kid. So it's not all biology. Parenting matters. It's not the cause, but it might affect the outcome. Next slide. Okay, we'd love to talk about this study, but we don't have time. Keep going, because there'll be no time for questions. Yeah, we'll stop right here. I'll say one thing about it. People who study parenting have come up with this kind of typology. And it's a little simplistic, but it's interesting. In every culture ever studied, throughout history, one dimension of parenting is, here's our x-axis, our horizontal axis. Warmth and responsiveness. Some parents, they didn't want to be parents, they were too young, they're too stressed with other things, not very warm with their kids at all the way to the most loving parents you've ever met. And what's really interesting is there's another dimension of parenting throughout history, across cultures. Everybody shows some degree of this, but it's uncorrelated with the first, so that's why they come in at right angles to each other. And that's the amount of control and limit setting you get. Some parents, it's Berkeley in the 60s. Hang out with me, and good luck till you're 18. Versus other parents, homework will be done now, for 37 minutes and 12 seconds, and then dinner arrives, right? Weird structure. So, classically, high warmth and responsiveness, along with high limit setting and control, is authoritative. You really love your kid, but you're not afraid to let your kid know what the rules are, and you really enforce those rules. But let's move sort of on the top now to the other side. You're pretty controlling, but there's not that warmth. That's authoritarian, very strict. Go back, authoritative, and go down. You're high on the warmth, but not so controlling. It's permissive. What does permissive parenting breed? Sometimes a lot of creativity and sometimes a lot of chaos. Right? It depends on the kid, it depends on the parents. What's the worst combination by far? Very little love and warmth and support and very little control. Uninvolved, and of course if you go down all the way to the bottom here, it's neglectful. Child neglect, not that you ever want to choose, is far worse in terms of predicting bad outcome than it's sexual abuse. Neglected kids do terribly, cognitively and emotionally. So the idea is that high warmth and high control are optimal. Maybe that's not true for everybody, for every kid in every culture. But if you go to the next slide, and don't worry about this, let's go to the next slide. We did a study with our boys a number of years ago who attended our camps in Berkeley. And we tried to predict in this study who was liked by their peers at the end of the summer. Not who did badly, who failed in our classes, or who was rejected. Who developed a really good, competent set of positive peer relationships. So we recorded every behavior they did from the first minute of the first day, to were they aggressive, were they covertly sneaky, were they sort of sad and shy and anxious, internalizing. The only significant predictor for the boys with ADHD was their mom's scores on authoritative parenting. Now, the worst way to measure parenting is to give a scale. You really should go into the homes and observe. On my parenting scale, you'll find that I've never broken a promise to my 3 sons. I've always been on time for their sporting events. And people bullshit on scales like this, right? But the scale we used, developed at Berkeley, was harder to fake good answers on. So, it was hard for the families of the boys with ADHD to have high authoritative parenting, high warmth and limits. But if you did, your kid was very popular at our camp. It might be a protective factor. Let's go to the next. What about girls? When I was in graduate school at UCLA a long time ago, we learned that girls really don't get what was then called hyperactivity, and then changed to ADD, and then changed to ADHD. And now we know, just as with autism, just as with eating disorders, boys are more likely to get it, but girls certainly can't. So we started almost 20 years ago, applied for a big federal grant, to do our summer camps for girls, not boys. And we got our samples called the BGALS, the Berkeley Girls with ADHD Longitudinal Study. We followed them up 5 years, 10 years. We're now just finishing our 15-year follow-up. The girls, when they were in our summer programs, some of them looked a lot like boys. They were hell on wheels. They were hard to control. More of the girls had this inattentive form. Both of those groups did poorly academically and socially. We followed them up as teenagers. The girls with ADHD continued to have problems. And if you go to the next slide, we're going to go to the next slide now. We're going fast. One more. We measured something when they were about 20. They were between about 18 and 23 at our 10-year follow-up. We added questions and interviews about, have you ever attempted to take your life? Or are you engaging in cutting, self-mutilation, NSSI, non-suicidal self-injurious behavior? The goal is not to kill yourself, but the goal is to maim yourself in some way to express a deep inner pain. Most of the time in our studies of boys and girls, whether you've got that combined form of ADHD with a lot of impulsivity and a lot of inattention, or you've just got that purely inattentive form, it doesn't really matter. The outcomes are difficult either way. But here was the exception for our girls. But darker green, those girls who showed up at our camps when they were 7 to 11 years of age in grade school, who were really impulsive as well as inattentive. 23% had attempted to kill themselves by the time they were 20. Only 8% of the purely inattentive and 6% of our perfectly normal comparison girls who participated alongside them. 6% of the normal comparison group, that must be Berkeley. That must be way out of line. That's the national average. If you have a teenage girl, you know. Adolescence, the first 10 years of life are the hard period for boys. The second 10 years of life are the hard period for girls. And if you've got that early impulsivity, girls with ADHD are really high risk. And we're not talking about thinking about it. That was way over 50%. This was an actual attempt. Now, NSSI, non-suicidal self-injurious behavior, cutting, burning, banging your head against a radiator till you bleed or see bumps. 51% of the girls originally diagnosed with the combined type, so they have a lot of impulsivity as well as inattention, were seriously harming themselves. About a quarter of the inattentive and 19% of our normative comparison group. 19% of the normal girls? That's the national average. Cutting is an epidemic now in high schools, college campuses. But if you've got that early impulsivity, and it's hard for you to regulate your emotions, and you've been failing in school, and all the girls think you're weird because you're weirder than the other girls, even though a lot of girls are weird. Okay, it's cool to be sort of weird, but if you've got ADHD, you're really weird. Because you don't get what the other girls are thinking, and you're not quite as quick socially. These are the really serious results. So we're just finished our 15-year follow-up. Both of our 10-year and 15-year, we've got well over 90% of the participants back because we're relentless and because we use Facebook to track our subjects as they get older, which is a really good way to do that. We're hoping that there's at least a subset of this 23% and 51% who are finding in their 20s, vocationally or in relationships or mentors, some way of getting out of this terrible pain and carrying. So girls with ADHD is no laughing matter. In fact, some of the outcomes are worse than even for boys. Let's go to that. So, midway through the lecture, ADHD is not just a category in the DSM. It has a lot to do with genes, and it has a lot to do with families and schooling. We haven't talked much about schooling. What's the right kind of classroom environment? Sort of a loaded question. It depends on what kind of ADHD the kid has and what his or her strengths and weaknesses are. Different pathways might lead to ADHD a little bit later in life. ADHD is not always a terrible risk factor for later problems. You may do well, you may do poorly. It depends on a whole lot of intervening factors. Medicines are pretty good, as we'll talk about, getting the symptoms under control, but the medicines don't teach you schoolwork, the medicines don't teach you study skills, and the medicines don't teach you social skills. You've got to combine treatments. And this is a very heritable biological condition, but the context you're in and the support you get matters a lot. Questions so far? So this is the first little segment, although we're running late because we had 15 minutes outside, so we didn't lose our hearing. Questions? Yes?
Children or adults that have been diagnosed
So the question is, what if you've got pretty serious depression, anxiety, and ADHD? Which do you treat first? This is one of the $64 billion questions. So the topic here is comorbidity. Greek word, comorbid, two illnesses, co-presence of two illnesses or more. Most people with ADHD don't just have ADHD, they've got a learning disorder, some of them. Or they're pretty aggressive, or they're depressed or anxious, or they develop a substance use disorder. If we knew, come back in about 50 years, when we've done a lot more longitudinal studies, when in development these problems of the depression type or the ADHD type first emerged, and whether we should treat one first, nobody knows the right answer to that question right now. We do know that kids with ADHD, if they get good treatment for ADHD, often get less depressed and anxious. But some of them may need treatments for the beyond the ADHD, for the anxiety or depression, that the ADHD treatments don't take care of. You've got to get a really good doctor who knows the evidence-based treatments, and you've got to systematically do some trial and error. Now, if there's a misdiagnosis, if a person is so anxious that they look like they're inattentive, but they're really just anxious, you've got to treat the anxiety. But if it's really both, there's a good bet that treating the ADHD will help, but you might need other treatments for the other conditions too. So that's the short answer. Right here.
So you just barely mentioned it, addiction in your studies that you've done of the kids over 10 to 15 years. Did you notice increase in addiction, substance, or event or state addiction?
Sure. So, interestingly, and I'm going really fast, and we only have a short time anyway, in our girls' sample, we didn't find as much, other than tobacco, alcohol or illicit drug use as most of the long-term studies have done with boys. Instead, maybe because it's 2010 to 2015, and maybe because there's an epidemic of it, it's as though a lot of the girls become young women were turning to self-injury rather than drugs.
So what about boys, though?
What about boys? On average, compared to boys who don't have ADHD, there's a 2.5 to 3-fold increase in the likelihood that boys will binge drink sooner and more and go to often marijuana to calm me down, make me feel better, or to speed, or to downers, or to heroin. And most boys with ADHD as they get older don't become dependent on substances, but about 3 times more do than the normal group, so it's a big risk.
What about electronics?
What about electronics?
Like actual physical, like gambling or,
Yeah, so this is a big question. Is there really such thing as a gambling addiction, sex addictions, etc.? There's research now coming out that internet addiction, gambling addiction, also about 3 times higher in people. Not surprising. Right here.
Are there any studies done in terms of if a child is medicated very early on, whether that's a predictor if they will develop addiction problems later on?
So, huge important question. If we can get the kids treated, especially with medication, early, well, on the one hand, that's going to kind of tell their brains, we're going to give you a lot of dopamine, because that's what these medications do. It's going to make you more likely to get addicted later on if you try. No, it's just the opposite. You'll do better in school, and you'll do better in your peer group, and it'll prevent. Well, there's only one way to know that. Take 1,000 first-grade boys and randomly assign 500 medicine and 500 placebo for the next 15 years. You can't do it. It's unethical. So what you're left with is, let's get 1,000 boys. There's about 500 of them who look like they got medication pretty regularly, and 500 who never took it. Well, why? Well, we'll try to match up on how severe they were, what kind of families they came from. The problem is you can never quite match up. And what happens? On average, it's equal. There's probably a subgroup of kids with ADHD for whom the medications do shape their brain to get a little more addictive potential. There's more for whom good medication probably reduces it, and you put them together, it washes out. So the problem is, because these are kids, we can't randomly assign kids to, of course, what we wanted to do for this authoritative parenting study was take a bunch of kids and randomly assign them for the next 10 years to live with authoritative versus free. Can't do it. There's clues, but there's so, I mean, that's what I was talking about. There's so many other genetic and non-genetic factors that it comes down to how well do you know this kid, and is there really an individualized treatment plan, and is there really somebody following, and it takes a lot of work. Right here.
Are there any studies that you're aware of that have looked at the environmental factors of the public school system in which kids with ADHD have done better in certain circumstances?
Yeah, do kids with ADHD do better in a private school or a public school? Do they do better in an open classroom? Talk about no limits. Every kid looks like he or she has ADHD. Or do they do better in a very structured classroom? Well, they stand out like a sore thumb, but maybe they'll learn better later. Again, no one can randomly assign kids to various schools. So when you take everything else into account, the effects are small, but it depends on this. This kid would have done better, hindsight's 2020, in a small, private environment that afforded it with a lot of one-on-one attention. But this other kid loved the big public school because she could get into cooking, or he could get into photography, activities where you can move around a lot. There is some evidence that beyond the school years, people with ADHD, especially the combined type, who get into pretty active professions, not sitting at a desk, not doing piecework, but you're moving around and you're controlling a little bit of your own business if you have the skills, you do better because you don't have to sit there letting your ADHD symptoms leak out all over.
Is there any correlation with
ADHD and bipolar disorder? Well, I think that concludes our presentation. This is a big, complicated issue. 30 years ago, the psychiatrist said bipolar disorder cannot exist before the age of 16 or 18. It just simply can't. Your body and brain have to get into late adolescence before you get those cycles of mania and depression. Then a research group in Boston said, oh, that's wrong. Bipolar disorder can exist in kids, but it doesn't have the classic cycles that an adult does. These are kids who are chronically hyperactive and anxious and depressed at the same time. Well, that's true, but is that bipolar disorder? So, if you believe that that was really bipolar disorder, you pull the kids off stimulants, and you get mood stabilizer or antipsychotic medications, and a lot of kids were gaining 15, 20, 30 pounds, which is one of the side effects of the antipsychotic medications. And finally, our colleague in Washington, Ellen Liebenluft, a child psychiatrist, said there's a very small group of kids with ADHD who have true bipolar disorder. There's a larger group who have bipolar disorder, but their episodes are very short, and their manias are very irritable, not grandiose like in adults. And there's a larger group that don't have any mood cycles at all, who get mislabeled with bipolar disorder, and they don't have it in the least. So there's a middle ground there, but you need, talk about needing more than a 10-minute evaluation, right? Right here.
Do you have any information about the long-term consequences of being on medication? Because if it's an adult, it's not now, what does it affect 30, 40 years down the line?
So we don't really have studies beyond about 30 years of medication. The question is how long the medication effects last and how long term. But the catch is what? Almost every adolescent I've ever worked with pretty serious ADHD, who did well on medications, around the age of 14 or 15 or 16 says, I'll never take this crap again. I don't feel creative and spontaneous. I don't want my friends to know. I don't really have ADHD. Why did my parents make me get that diagnosis? There's a huge denial, and maybe the medications are making them somewhat irritable. So the bottom line is, if you take as 100% of the kids with ADHD who take medication, by 18 that number's about 12%. About 7 out of 8 kids stop. If you can get a kid to stay on, and that kid is college material and goes, then you can say, well, maybe only Monday, Wednesday, Friday during your lecture class. Tuesday, Thursday. The stimulants are short-acting enough, you don't have to give, like most other medications, 7 days a week, first thing in the morning. And some people would say that if you give medications year after year, well, maybe you have to raise the dose, and your body gets a little used to it, and after a few years, the medicines which spur the release of dopamine in your brain start to burn out those dopamine receptors, and you don't respond to stimulants anymore. So that's true. We know that's true for SSRIs for some people with depression and anxiety. Some people kind of burn out after 3 or 5 or 10 years. That's probably true for a subgroup of ADHD, but there's not enough studies in adulthood yet to know. The bottom line, If you've got ADHD and you do well on medication, you might need it for a while, but a flexible approach with a doctor who says adjusting the dose, maybe not every day, depends on the kind of job you get. It's a little bit different from some people would say, it's just like diabetes, you're going to need insulin every day of your life. Well, ADHD shows its symptoms differently in different situations. Again, that adult at 25 who forced to be in an office environment in a cubicle and can never move may look very different if they got a different job or are more active. So the medications need depends on where you are, kind of in life. Let's go on to a few more slides. We'll go to the next one. This is the part where we'll go quickly through. Is ADHD exploding? And the answer is yes. How do we know? The Centers for Disease Control 15 years ago said, we're not going to just study whooping cough anymore or the flu. We're going to study ADHD and autism. I mean, imagine that. Government had never done that before. So there's this thing called the National Survey of Children's Health. That had been going on for some time. And so maybe you got one of these calls some years ago. Random phone dials, cell phones, landlines. Is there a kid in this household between 4 and 17? We'd like to ask you questions, blah, blah, blah. So a lot of families agree, about 50% agree. One of the questions is, has a professional ever told you or diagnosed this child in question with hyperactivity, ADD, or ADHD? Yes or no? And if yes, does your child take medication, and what's the name of it? In 2003, the first year they did that, 7.8% of all families in the United States said, yep, my kids have that diagnosis. 4 years later, it was up to 9.5%, and 4 and 5 years later, it was up to 11%. 1 out of every 9 kids in America has been diagnosed. That's a 41% increase in 9 years. Do the genes that cause ADHD, did they mutate across 9 years? Darwin would turn over in his grave. It would take 900 or 9,000 years. Something's going on. It's going up really quickly. And I mentioned before, just under 70% of those kids diagnosed get medication. That has stayed flat over the last 10 years. The big rise is in adults. Next slide. We're going to go to the next slide. And we're going to go one more. What's really interesting is not just the overall trends, but it's the state-by-state trends. In the last collection point, the data wave of the National Survey of Children's Health, 2011 finished in 2012. If you lived in Arkansas, North Carolina, or Indiana, those are our top 3, the rate overall is about 1 in 5. And if you're the parents of a boy, and your boy's above 11, it's 1 in 3. 33% of all boys in North Carolina have had an ADHD diagnosis by middle school. Same in Indiana, same in Arkansas. That's crazy. I know that's a terrible stigmatizing word to use, but it's crazy. But what about California and Nevada? We're way behind the times. It's about 6%. It's where the rest of the world is. The rest of the world, other than subsistence nations, the rest of the world that has compulsory education, it's 5% across the board. It's almost like somebody made up the data. If you put compulsory education in, about 5 to 6% of kids don't do very well in the one-room schoolhouse or in the public school. They've got those genes that make it really difficult for them to focus and hit their impulses. But in the United States, we're double that, and in the South, we're 5 times that. Anybody got any ideas? We thought about this for 3 years. This is a hard puzzle. Let's go to the next slide. Same thing for medication. So now the question is, okay, you've got a kid in this household with ADHD. Does he or she get medication for the ADHD? Now it's not just the South, it's the Plains and the Upper Midwest and Vermont and Michigan. 80% of the kids get medicated. Nevada under 50%, and California just over 50%. Something's going on across the state lines. So we tried to figure out what the heck was going on. Next slide, please. It has to be that, what's the Latino, Hispanic population in California? Much higher than in North Carolina or Arkansas or Indiana. And until recently, Hispanic folks were less likely to get their kids diagnosed. So what we did was, We put a little equation and pretended that there was the same number of African American and Latino and Asian and white in every state, and it didn't take away the difference. So it wasn't that. Okay, next idea. It's the number of doctors. If you look for rates of cancer, there's big differences across the states and across counties within the state, depending on where the doctors are. People move to places where they get treatment. Not true for ADHD. The same rates of pediatricians and child psychiatrists across these different states. So now we're scratching our heads. Oh, it's got to be culture. In the South, it's a culture of honor, and we're all rugged individualists in the West Coast. And, it's a lot of BS. We couldn't figure out anything that made any sense. And then next slide, we looked at school policies. What is consequential accountability? These are the laws that started about 25, 30 years ago, where states said for the public schools, America's falling behind. Our test scores are cruddy compared to other nations. Your district won't get funding, or will put your school in the newspaper, or in receivership, unless those scores are coming up every year. So you're accountable for your test scores, and there's consequences if the scores aren't going up. 30 states had passed such laws by 1999. Those were all the southern states. Those were the states that already had the high diagnoses 10, 15 years ago. Is there something going on here? So here was our little test, sort of experimental test. What happened in 2001 and 2? Bush got elected and passed No Child Left Behind, which took effect in the 2002-2003 school year. No Child Left Behind made consequential accountability happen for the remaining 21 states. 21 Wills District of Columbia, too. So the states who had this before, the schools were really accountable for their test scores. And now the remaining 21 states, all of a sudden, first day of the school year, fall 2002, they're under consequential accountability. Next slide. Next slide. And right there. If this is the blue line that's going up fast, if you're in one of those 21 states that quickly got those accountability laws, through No Child Left Behind, and you were a poor kid, you were within 200% your family of the federal poverty level, 60% greater chance of getting an ADHD diagnosis in the next 4 years. But if you were in the same state and you were a middle class or upper class kid, only an 8% chance. Nobody passed No Child Left Behind to diagnose ADHD. They wanted, obviously, kids to do better on their tests. But a district who says, we've got a lot of kids aren't doing very well, if we get them diagnosed, and most of these districts are the poor urban districts with a lot of Title I schools, a lot of poor kids, what will happen? Well, we could get the kid assessed and treated, or, next slide, or, in a lot of regions in the country, if the kid got in special ed with an ADHD diagnosis, the kid's scores didn't count for the district's average. So some schools were gaming the system. Let's get a kid. And how are these kids getting diagnosed? In 10 minutes in that pediatrician's office, with no rule outs and no. So you can get very cynical. One of the reasons that ADHD has become explosive is it might let districts off the hook. Or it might get my kid an accommodation. If you really took the time to diagnose, and what about the comorbidities, and what about the developmental sequencing of treatments? This is hard work, serious business. So there are policies in schools that I think have inflated. I don't think ADHD is really twice as prevalent in America as the rest of the world, but I think some of these policy things, that's the fancy term. The true prevalence is probably the same everywhere, but the diagnostic prevalence, who gets assessed and diagnosed, there's probably some incentives in our country that make it more likely that the kids are. Questions about this? Yes, sir. No, let's go here. Yeah.
So, as a parent, it's a really tough thing. I mean, you've got free public education, and then you have the schools which are trying to protect their environment, academic environment. And if you know that this is happening to your kids in school, as a parent, you're limited in your choices. I mean, you have to make a choice. Do you keep with the system, or do you try to find a more supportive environment? What, in your experience, are your options?
The options are, I mean, let's go back to some basics. under the Education for All Handicapped Children Act, 1975, changed to IDEA in 1991, reauthorized a couple times since. The federal government mandates free education, least restrictive alternative, according to your needs, with an IEP in place. But what did the federal government fail to do? Fund it. It's called an underfunded mandate. The mandate is the schools have to do it, but the federal dollars are about only 28% of the cost. So the districts are screwed, pardon my French, right? For every kid who gets an accommodation, much less a special day class, much less a residential, what's the cost? We want to keep those numbers low, and some districts, frankly, can afford more of that, some less. You have to know your district. You should know this more. We're spending a lot of our time with our kids now. Our kids anymore, they're adults, so I don't follow this quite as much in the Bay Area. There are some private alternative schools that are really good. Some are really expensive. Some are evidence-based. Some are flaky. I mean, ADHD attracts, especially in California. Well, just go to the websites, right? It's really depressing. Autism may be even worse. Dolphin therapy, chelation. What chelation is? If you get lead poisoning, they put your blood through a machine and it leaches the lead out. So now that's one of the treatments for ADHD. We're going to put your blood through this machine and it'll cure your ADHD, your autism. I mean, it's shocking how harmful it can be and how there's no evidence for it. So I have worked with a lot of families, some of whom have stuck with their public school and been to meetings and got that IEP enforced, and it's really worked. And in others, the public school couldn't do it or the alternatives couldn't do it, and it's so individualized that there's no rule. Right here, you had a question.
I'm trying to link the dots with what you just said, because, I mean, pediatricians don't get kickback from school to diagnose kids with ADHD. And then I also, my understanding is that pediatricians can't diagnose ADHD. I thought it had to be a developmental pediatrician.
Oh, if that were the case, I mean, developmental behavioral pediatrics and child and adolescent psychiatrists are endangered species. You don't have to have a specialty thing to diagnose any condition in the United States. Any doctor can do it. And, one of the slides I skipped over, go back 20-some years, a big thing that got ADHD on the map in the early 90s was a reauthorization of Medicaid. Medicaid then in the 90s said, oh, ADHD is one of the diagnoses that if you're under the poverty level, you can get. And what happens? You get reimbursed for the diagnosis and for medication, but there's no reimbursement for any other treatment. So there's an incentive to diagnose poor kids with ADHD who used to never get diagnosed. Now the rates are higher than middle-class kids. And the only treatment you can get if you're a Medicaid kid is meds, because the doctors get not a dime for parent management or school counseling, consultation, summer camps, or anything. So it's a bit of a scam.
So how like, school officials cannot diagnose ADHD, right?
School officials cannot. Under an IEP, a school psychologist could make, obviously, there could be a learning problem. ADHD may be a diagnosis, but it takes so darn long to get these things done at many schools. Families that go out to their pediatrician and get it diagnosed. Question here.
Yeah, I had an evaluation for my son, and it came back inconclusive, but very, very borderline. And they want to give him the TABO computer test because
The
of
TOVA?
that. TOVA. Mm-hmm.
So, how do you assess ADHD? If only we had the brain scan, right? If only we could say, oh, your cortex is this many millimeters, and yours is this, and you're 7.5, you've got ADHD. We're not even close to that. You can't diagnose bipolar disorder, you can't diagnose schizophrenia on the basis of a brain scan. We're far from that. Maybe we'll get there someday. Or parent ratings, teacher ratings, maybe the parent was in a bad mood that day, maybe the teacher was stressed. Let's sit the kid in front of a computer screen and show the symbols, and you hit the space bar when the X appears, and you hit the other bar when the Y appears, etc., etc. Tests of sustained attention. The TOVA, there's many like this. Good idea, it's objective, but many people with ADHD do great because it's one-on-one. And you put them in a classroom and they fall apart.
That's what I was thinking.
Many perfectly normal kids don't like computers or aren't very good at it. There's false positives and negatives. The only way, ADHD is the lowest tech diagnosis around. You've got to get parents interviewed. You've got to talk to teachers. You should observe a classroom or two. You should talk to last year's teacher as well. You should get a sense. You should talk with the peers. We should hire second graders as our assessors. They know who's going to their birthday parties, right? It's a preponderance of evidence that this is not a kid with a major depression. This is not a kid with a neurological illness who, for the damnedest reason, just can't get their act together year after year, and it's frustrating, and they're trying. So it's a disorder of poor executive functions. Russ Barkley say it's not what you know, it's applying what you do know. It's a performance deficit, it's an executive deficit, and it takes a long time and a lot of information. It's not very satisfying because there's no blood test. But there's no blood test for depression or bipolar disorder. Let's go to over this side, yeah.
Build on that. What is your opinion of the apparently with some machines with FDA? What
So now there's FDA approval for a brainwave machine to look at EEGs. What's EEGs? Put the little skull cap on and you get sort of electric signals coming out of your brain. Your brain arranges those in these patterns of waves. And we sort of know overall that most of you right now are showing these nice alpha and beta waves of attention. A lot of you are showing theta waves. You wish you were home. You've forgotten that there's even a talk going on right now. And so if we just classify those waves, it's like a brain scan, it's like a blood test, it's objective. The actual data of about 250 kids were very unimpressive. It helped a little bit. It's one more objective indicator, but it's not a magic bullet. Everything would be good to make it more objective than not. But remember, ADHD shows itself when there's different contexts. The doctor who says, well, it can't be ADHD. The parents told me that he could play video games for 5 consecutive hours. ADHD is not a disorder of poor attention. ADHD is a disorder of dysregulated attention. Not paying attention when you need to and paying too much attention to the wrong stuff, like video games or devices that are, I swear, whoever invented the first ones had ADHD in mind. Immediate reinforcement, colorful stimuli, fast-moving. Teacher can't compete, a parent can't compete. But the really interesting study was done by Rosemary Tannick up in Canada a couple of years ago. She had a big sample of kids with ADHD and a big sample of normal comparison kids play video games. And the kids with ADHD paid longer attention and they did far worse. The same executive and attention problems plagued them when they're playing video games, even though they seemed to be glued to the screen. Right here.
You haven't touched on it yet, but I think about it is very much the question. Food and ADHD.
Right. So we're sort of getting into the treatment part. Speaking of food, if somebody would get me a water, without it, I'm going to go collapse in about 3 more minutes. I can feel my thermostat. That's great. So food and diet is really interesting. This is the place, the Bay Area, thanks very much, where Dr. Feingold did his famous Feingold diet at Oakland Kaiser back almost 50 years ago. And what did Dr. Feingold say? If you remove additives, dyes, and salicylates, so no bananas and apples from their diet, he said 70% of the kids were cured. What was the problem? He never had a control group. What do you have to do to enforce the Feingold diet in your kids? One thing, control. No ding-dongs in the lunchbox. Bake your own bread. You monitor the child every second after school. When they did the control studies, when they actually put the food in the house under fake labels every few weeks, only 5% of kids really showed a response to the Feingold diet. But the British, over the last few years, have said, you really have to look at these dyes. Red number 3, yellow number 12. Those are consistently adding a symptom or two of ADHD, especially kids under 10. So, from diet's everything to diet is really kind of a non-issue. The position now is, A, every kid should have more protein and less fat and sugar. Number 2, certain kids may be exquisitely sensitive to certain additives and dyes, and you really have to watch that. But number 3, even if you rigorously control that, the effects are nowhere near the effects of medication or a good behavioral treatment. It's helpful, but it's not the full program. So who else, Ray? You had one. Let's go to something new. Yeah.
Is there any studies that are performed for extensive use of TV, electronics, and impulse behavior?
Right. Now I'm spilling water on myself, so just ignore that. TV, electronics. Guess what? Kids with ADHD spend more time on these than other kids. So they avoid homework, it's distracting, fast-paced, etc., etc. Does the TV or media use cause ADHD? That's a very strong statement. It might maintain it. In the way that that negative parenting didn't cause it, might maintain it. If you're avoiding homework and avoiding peer groups and avoiding team sports and you're just glued, you're losing out on a lot of learning opportunities. And you kind of get used to the fact that the only thing that motivates you is really fast-paced SpongeBob or whatever. Right here.
Can you talk a little bit about omega-3 fatty acids' effect on ADHD symptoms?
So, what about omega-3s? Omega-3 fatty acids in certain fish, well, the problem is heat. Enough fish to do it, some of the fish are poisoned to eat. So, supplements are the right kind of fish. These are not like taking a stimulant medication for ADHD. It's not going to like pretty quickly if you're a responder show. But omega-3s are building a better central nervous system and better neurons in there. So there's some interesting data now that over many months or even longer, it's not a matter of let's erase those ADHD symptoms. Omega-3s on top of other treatments may be a protective thing. So hard to do that kind of controlled research, but I think it's promising. So let's go here. Yeah.
Is there studies on kids undereating or overeating?
So, good question. Kids with ADHD who are on the stimulants, what's the two big side effects of stimulants? You stay awake and you lose your appetite. So a lot of kids are underweight. If you take stimulants at a pretty high dose for 3 or 4 years, you might lose a centimeter or 2 of your adult stature. So you might not grow quite as tall. Not because you're eating less, but because one of the effects of taking a stimulant is it increases dopamine, and the dopamine hits a little switch in the brain, and it slows down growth hormone, ever so slightly. But it's when you get into adolescence that we have found, and others have found, that especially girls with ADHD are at risk for eating disorders like binge eating and bulimia. They're not very regulated in the first place, maybe don't have very good dietary habits in the first place, concerned about their weight, binge, purge, and so there's a link there. You saw it in the paper, maybe, it came out about 4 or 5 weeks ago in Denmark, where they have data on only 5 million people across a 40-year span. ADHD was associated significantly with earlier mortality through accidents and through coronaries and poor nutritional kinds of things. It's a small effect, but ADHD may generate in people who don't get good treatment some poor lifestyle choices later on as well. So there are health risks. Yeah, that's the short answer. Let's go with somebody right here.
What are your thoughts on Mark Steinberg's neurofeedback?
So, another treatment. It's the most intuitively cool treatment you could think of. I'm sitting here, I've got ADHD, put the electrodes on me, I'm sitting in front of a screen, and my waves are kind of doing funky things, I'm not very focused. And then through a little coaching and guidance, the doctor says, think of calm things, or let's practice some cognitive strategies, and all of a sudden, my waves are more focused, and that screen turns from a bright, gaudy red to green, or a firework or a star comes across. And what does the clinician say? Whatever you're doing, do that. You have just shown focus, so the person learns to control their own brain waves to get to a more focused state. It's self-management, it's really cool. There's been a few studies a few years ago that weren't very good. There's some better studies now that show, A, people can learn to focus, but B, the effect kind of goes away when you go to the soccer field or do homework. It doesn't last very long. That's the problem with ADHD treatment. And then the third is, right now, in Columbus, Ohio, and Indiana, and a couple of other places, They're doing a big study of this EEG biofeedback called neurofeedback. Because a lot of people think it might really be a long-term solution. But they're doing something kind of interesting in this study. So there's hundreds of people in it, and a third of them get the full boat EEG neurofeedback. And a third of them are in a kind of control group. They get it after waiting some months. And a third group gets the electrodes on their head, and they get the feedback, except that the screen changes color at random intervals, not tuned in to their brainwaves. And they run the first 50 subjects, and both the real biofeedback and the fake are equally good. Because once you put the electrode cap on, you kind of think, I'm going to get better. So the problem with biofeedback for a lot of conditions is there's a big placebo effect. Because you think, oh my God, this is space age, I'm going to get better. So we don't know yet if it's going to work long term. But it's a really interesting alternative. It's expensive. I wouldn't, if it were my kid, I wouldn't use it in place of a good behavioral program or medication, but I think about it. Right here.
How about caffeine pills or mindfulness studies?
Caffeine pills. Does caffeine work better than placebo for your attention? I've never had a cup of coffee in my life, but I've talked to a lot of friends. Yes, but the effect is very small. By the time you get enough caffeine in you to have anywhere near a stimulant effect, you've got the caffeine shakes. You've ruined your credit card at Starbucks. It's a big problem. So caffeine, there was a doctor in the Bay Area, I won't mention names, who used to prescribe Jolt Cola for kids. Terrible idea. Caffeine is a stimulant just the way methylphenidate and dextroamphetamine are. It ups the flow of dopamine in the brain and gets the reward centers going, but it's not a viable treatment.
And I'm sorry, mindfulness?
Mindfulness.
Meditation.
Good new idea. A guy named Mark Burton, B-E-R-T-I-N, is back in Boston. He's a developmental pediatrician. Just published a book on mindfulness for ADHD. And he's not just saying meditation. He's saying for parent management, yeah, you got to learn to do a refrigerator chart, you got to do timeout, but you've also got to get your own life a little more regulated. If you believe the genetic stuff I talked about a little while ago, what percentage of the biological parents of kids with ADHD have the symptoms themselves? About 40 to 45%. If you want to do parent management training for a kid with ADHD, you have to make the parent almost a kind of super parent. Calm, you don't raise your voice, that behavior is consequated here, you go to your timeout shift. What if you've got ADHD as a parent? And your checkbook hasn't been balanced in a few years, and you're tending to anger demonstrations yourself, and so maybe a more mindful approach, and there's no data on this yet, but it's pretty interesting. So we got to go fast. Way over here.
What is a good behavior program?
So that's what we want to get into. Let's do a couple more questions, and we'll see if we can go a little bit further. Yes?
What about physical activity? I mean, I've seen that many a times there's this high spurt of energy that you need to burn, otherwise it's going to be bad.
So 3 studies in the last year comparing daily aerobic exercise to sitting in a study hall for kids with ADHD, and there's some improvement. Is it as good as a medicine? No. Is it as good as a behavioral program? No. But it's something. In animal models, if you want to make a hyperactive rat, you deprive the rat of any physical activity. It's in the brain changing. So it's like neurofeedback. It's promising, but it's not the full boat answer. It's like diet. It's one step along the path. But what are, let's go to the next slide. We've got to finish up a few things. What are the only 2 treatments that actually, beyond the shadow of a doubt, work for ADHD? The meds and the behavioral treatments for kids, which turn into cognitive behavioral treatments for adults. What's cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT? Well, you had that reaction. What were you thinking? Let's try a different thinking strategy. And your thinking may affect your behavior and your emotions. And for kids, it's a little too much mental work if you've got ADHD. Everything else, the biofeedback and the diet and the dolphin therapy, I mean, I'm mixing good and bad things together. Some are promising. None have passed the bar yet. Omega-3s we talked about a little bit. Mindfulness we talked about a little bit. A lot of people say, a lot of doctors in the Bay Area, especially with the medical marijuana dispensaries, etc., well, it's a great way to calm the anxiety because of the ADHD. What does marijuana do in every study ever done with animals or humans? It decreases your attention, it decreases your motivation, it decreases your learning. It's not good for kids with ADHD. It might, for a teen, decrease anxiety, etc., but they're not going to learn. Enough said. Go to the next slide. You've got to monitor. If you give medications as a doctor, and you say, well, here's this pill, and call me if there's a problem, I'll see you in 6 months. A lot of kids start with Ritalin or Concerta or Daytrana, the patch. It doesn't work. The majority of those kids, if you went to Adderall or Dextrine, it would work. There's no way to know ahead of time. If you develop a gene screening device or a test to predict which kid or adult would respond to which medication at which dosage, would you text me after this meeting and we will retire next month? Would be a gold mine. You have to do trial and error. Nobody knows yet, there's no genomic medicine yet, which form of the medicine and which dose works best. You've got to try several different ones. The doctor, when we did our big study on treatments in Berkeley a few years back, we saw the families every week for the first month and every month for the next year and a half. That's the monitoring it took to really get good results. And similarly, behavior model, just give the kid rewards. Which rewards? What's the schedule? How do you transition the kid off the reward program to more self-management? Take somebody meeting with the family weekly for a long time. These are not lightweight treatments. Next slide. I'm going to go kind of quick. So the most documented medications for ADHD are stimulants. Stimulants are dopamine enhancers. They're SDRIs. They're selective dopamine reuptake inhibitors in the way that an SSRI is a selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor. You take a stimulant, the dopamine stays in the synapse longer, and where does dopamine operate in the brain? In the reward pathways, and in the attentional pathways, and in the inhibition pathways. Just the three things we talked about an hour ago. Until recently, not recently, but a decade and a half ago, you had to take these pills several times a day. Now you can take many formulations of them maybe once a day or maybe once and then a smaller regular dosage in the afternoon. There are some norepinephrine pills, not dopamine pills, that work for some people with ADHD. Let's go to the next slide. We're just giving a big overview. The biggest response rate in child psychiatry is in the ADHD area. 80% of kids who get with ADHD who get stimulants do better. Sometimes a little bit better, sometimes a huge bit better, usually a medium amount better. And it's only about 10 to 15% on placebo. That's a big gap. But the main improvement is on symptoms, not on other important things. So stay tuned for a minute. The medicines make you less fidgety because you're more alert. They make you more inhibited. Oh, crap, it isn't my birthday. I won't blow out the candles. It buys you that second. It's really important. Next slide. It should be called selective dopamine reuptake inhibitors. We'll talk about that later. We'll talk about the dopamine paths in the brain. We're going to go to the next slide. What is a good behavioral treatment for a kid with ADHD look like? First, you've got to educate the parents about what ADHD is. It's not your fault, but it's your responsibility. Then you've got to help the parents learn how to count and measure behaviors. My kid's pretty hyper. Was he hyper today? I don't know, I guess so. No, you've got to count the number of minutes she sat at the dining room table, or the number of English homework problems he attempted. You can't know if there's improvement unless you count. And these kids will piss you off so much that even if there is improvement, one bad thing will happen and you think all is lost. And then you just talk to the kid and you observe your kid and see what do they like to do. Rewards are what the kid likes to do. How many families have I seen who said these reward programs don't work, Dr. Hinshaw? What's the reward you've been using? Oh, that public television special for the pledge week. The kid didn't choose that. The parents did. You can have little tiny rewards for small amounts of behavior, big rewards saved for over days or weeks or months. And kids with ADHD are insatiable. You've got to change up the rewards. You've got to stay ahead of the curve. Then you've got to say, here's the limits. You do this many minutes of homework, this amount of rewards. And what's the biggest mistake that people make in behavioral programs? You try too much, too soon. What's the baseline? 2.5 minutes before the kid falls off the chair and isn't doing homework. You get your reward tomorrow, Billy, for 20 minutes of homework. No, tomorrow it's 3.5 damn minutes. And you build gradually from there. If you try to build Rome in a day, it won't work. And if you're patient and you watch the rewards, build the behavior, then finally it might become intrinsically motivated. Then, only then, do you do the timeout or the subtracting of points, hitting of sister, that's a minus 50 points, right? What's a bad sign of the behavioral program? My child at the end of March is negative 8,000 points. If you're in a federal deficit level, you're not doing it right. It's got to be positive. You've got to have more positives rewarded than points taken away. So those are the questions before. Those are the basics of the behavioral program, right here.
I've struggled with this before when you have multiple kids, and one is got the most issues, another one has some, but the oldest one doesn't. How does that look fair? I mean, I know it's not fair, but you know.
You've heard of sibling rivalry. Wait till one of your kids has ADHD.
No,
I don't get rewarded for that. Why does she? It's not fair. Family meetings, sometimes some family therapy. What every kid does that's unique. What special need is. How old are the kids? Kids are going to be exquisitely sensitive to some kid getting more for what's standard behavior than they are. And if you don't talk it out and you don't get buy-in, it's going to tank. It's hard work. Absolutely. Let's go to the next slide. Oh, and then finally here, you can't stop the rewards at the end of March and say, well, it'll be great by June. If you're going to try to fade out rewards and reward something else, do it gradually. People with ADHD have these probably sensitive dopamine systems. They really count on those rewards, and if you stop them, their behavior extinguishes really fast. So let's go to the next slide. So in a funny way, the medicines that bump up dopamine in your brain and the behavioral treatments that are giving you these external rewards, what does that do? It bumps up dopamine in your brain. It's doing it in 2 different ways. Next slide. We did a big study. We're going to go to the next slide. Got to read fast. Where we randomly assigned a bunch of kids across the United States to either really good medicine, really intensive parent and school and summer camp behavior mod, both at the same time, or kind of regulated treatment community. Next slide. Next slide. Gotta read fast. What did we find? To reduce the symptoms of ADHD, the medicine that we gave, weekly visits for a month and monthly visits for the next 1.5 years, were just as good as the medicines plus all of that behavior management. If your goal was to get inattention boosted and impulsivity reduced, the medicine, if you give it right, it really works. But what if your goal, and that's what this slide is to improve math and reading scores and to get the kids more friends at school and to get the parents more authoritative in their parenting? It took, that's the dark purple line, lower is better, that's more improvement. Only the combination treatment, where you got really carefully delivered medicine at the kid's right dose, right for that kid, and all the parent management and school management we're talking about. Only then did you not only get the symptoms under control, but academics and social skills and parenting. There's a few kids with ADHD who have no other comorbidities and only are a little bit impulsive, and you give them medicine, they'll probably do great. Now, all 3 of them in the Bay Area are probably doing fine. Everybody else needs a lot more than that. I mean, being facetious, but not really. Next slide. However, next slide. What happened in our study, once the study ended after about 1.5 years, and then we said, well, everybody kind of goes back into regular community care. The big symptom advantage, see the lower lines for the medicine and the combination treatment group? 1 year later, they've lost some of their gains, and by 2 years later, by the time they're about 10, 11, or 12, they look just like the kids who never got that well-delivered medication. If you stop the treatment, the symptoms kind of go back to where they were. So the secret is, for those, like the question before, who are on medication doing well, how do you motivate kids staying on? But how do you continue the family involvement and the school involvement? I mean, remember this study, the MTA study, was done with elementary school kids. Try it in middle school or high school with 4, 5, or 6, or 7 different teachers. It's hard work to get a school system on board for a kid with ADHD in secondary school. So, just like a chronic illness like diabetes, what would you say, well, we stopped giving the insulin and the symptoms came back? Funniest thing. Well, duh. ADHD is more of a chronic condition. It changes over time. The most fidgety 8-year-olds don't fidget and squirm as much when they're 18 or 28, but they still have problems focusing, and they still have problems with impulse control. Next slide. We're going to go to the next slide. In this study, we found one group of kids, out of about 600, we found a group of 50 kids, this is the red line, whose families really improved their discipline. They got much more authoritative, better controls, and more warmth. And those families also got both the medicine and the behavioral treatment. So the improvement for that red line was better than the other 3 conditions, and if you trace the line over, I don't have a laser pointer, it's about 0.5 there if you go over. They were normal in their school behavior at the end of the study. So the kids who looked in the normal range were the kids who got this combination treatment whose parents dramatically improved their discipline. ADHD is a very biological condition, but parenting can make a difference. Next slide. Medicines help with symptoms. If you want to build skills, inevitably you need to combine the medicines with these behavioral treatments. And some kids don't do well on medications. You can't use them at all. That's a rare breed, but it sometimes happens. And if you have major depression, or if you have an actual learning disorder, you're going to need something different, because the ADHD treatments won't treat those. Next slide. Last topic. America's falling further behind in its test scores. We should put stimulants in the water supply. We catch up. Well, that's what's happening, not in the water supply. What percentage of PAL students are taking their friends or roommates stimulants? 15 to 20%. I gave a talk up in Marin County not too long ago, a little over a year ago, because the PTAs had called me in. The school newspapers at TAM and Sir Francis Drake and Redwood High, those are 3 high schools, had done a survey, confidential survey. 10% of the 9th graders and 41% of the 12th graders without ADHD said that they were taking other kids' stimulants. That's in high school. High-performance suburban high school. Well, what's the problem? Right? It helps kids with ADHD. Why shouldn't it help everybody? I mean, people drink coffee. Athletes try to chip away at steroids or stimulants. Well, number one, if you don't have ADHD and you take these stimulants, you will stay up later, but it doesn't help your learning at all. If you really have ADHD and these executive and motivational problems, you can find effects on learning. But the studies that have been done recently with normal college students taking stimulants, and one study just done last year, they gave 13 measures of learning, and on all 13 there was no difference between the medicine and the placebo. They gave a 14th measure, which was a single item rating scale. How did you do this week? And the college students who'd taken the stimulants, they could tell if you had a stimulant rather than placebo, said, oh, I did great, I aced the test. So stimulants boost your false self-confidence in your learning. You think you're learning better, but you're not. But here's the ultimate catch. If you have ADHD and you take stimulants under a pretty good doctor's care, what are the odds that you will get addicted to those pills yourself? Way under 1%, maybe a tenth of 1%. If you're a normal college student taking classes and you're way late on your term paper and you haven't studied for your midterm, and you start taking stimulants occasionally, what are the odds you'll get addicted? About 15%. And what does stimulant addiction look like? 2 words, Breaking Bad. Right? Methamphetamine is in the same class as all the stimulants. If you get addicted to stimulants, you cannot, paradoxically, you can't focus at all. It's terrible for your heart and health, and you can become psychotic, and it can do brain damage. So it's not like, gee, if only all college students could just take those ADHD medications, everybody would pass the GREs and everybody would get professional school, and America wouldn't be falling behind in performance. This is why these 10-minute office visits, both for kids and teens and adults, aren't adequate to diagnose. And if you're monitoring medication, you've got to be sure that these medicines stay in the right people's hands. So, let's go to somebody who has an answer, right here.
So with medications, you mentioned obviously it's trial and error. Kind of what on average, like how many different meds do people usually have to try before they find the right one?
Ever been to a slot machine? You put that first nickel in, sometimes you hit it. A friend of ours, I grew up in Columbus, Ohio, a dentist friend of our family's, went to Vegas some years ago. It's a long time ago now, about 20 years ago, and he played one nickel in a nickel slot, and he won $55,555.55. It's the only time he'd ever used a slot machine. That's rare. It's rare to have a doctor say, oh, it's Concerta and it's 37.5 milligrams. Usually it takes, I'd say 2/3 of the time you guess right and it's a methylphenidate rather than an dextroamphetamine. But it usually takes 2 or 3 different tries of dosage. If the dosage is too low, it's as though you haven't had it. If it's too high, you look like you're not focusing at all. So that's why in our summer camps over the years, we would do these dosage studies. Families say, why? I don't know why we're even bothering. These medicines don't work for my kid. We had one boy some years ago who came in on 120 milligrams of Ritalin a day, and he was 12 years old and he weighed 70 pounds. He was clearly over-medicated. We've had other kids come in who parents said, well, I don't know, I guess 5 milligrams twice a day. The doctor said that was plenty. And you go up to 15 and the kid's a different story. It probably will take a few weeks to a few months to really get away. Somebody over here, way in back, yeah. I got everything except the keyword. Which program?
Behavioral treatment.
Like the parent management we were talking about?
Yeah.
So, most practitioners still in the Bay Area do more play therapy or dynamic release therapy. There aren't too many people. There's more now who are doing these behavior management programs. Talk to Chad, talk to Ada, find the people out here or in your neighborhoods who are doing these evidence-based behavioral programs. They make a difference. Are they a cure? No, nothing is, but they help. Way in back.
Is there a too young an age? What's the youngest as far as medication?
Yeah, youngest for medication. So, late in 2011, AAP, the American Academy of Pediatrics, they've got these really cool guidelines now. Here's how you really diagnose ADHD. Believe me, you can't do it in 10 minutes. And here's how you give medicine, and here's how you do behavioral treatments. The catch is, most doctors don't read their guidelines, or even if they do and want to, they can't get reimbursed. But the point is, about 3.5 years ago, AAP said, it's kind of late in the game to start at 7 or 8 or 9. That's when most kids get referred, 2nd or 3rd or 4th grade, and they're starting to tank. You should start at 4. But when you start at 4, you should always start with school consultation and behavior mod first, and only go to medicine if you need it. Because we simply don't know if a 3 or 4-year-old brain is really helped or really harmed by the medication. Now, there's been 2 big studies of preschoolers with medication. They have more side effects than older kids. They get grouchier and lose their appetite and have more sleep problems. Probably they're not clearing the medicines from their bodies as quickly. And the effects aren't as big as they are if you wait a couple of years. But what if your 4-year-old who really has ADHD is running out in front of cars? Or what if that kid really has been thrown out of 3 preschools? Medicine is a last resort for young kids, but it may be a lifesaver. But you want to start with the psychological behavioral treatments first. Okay? Right here.
I'm curious for social issues. I feel like I can manage my son's all aspects of his life with medication and some therapies, but But the social thing, seems beyond reach. I don't know what the...
Yeah, well, your kid's probably like a lot of kids. The last person you ever talk with about your friends is your parent. You're not going to get advice from your parent about your peers. It's like, keep away. And even if you said helpful things, you don't know what peer groups like. It's all, well, half of it's online now, in ways we are only beginning to know. And so here's the big controversy. If you do, as a parent or as a teacher, and you're rewarding the kid, really helps with behavior and academics, but it's really not teaching social skills. So what some people do is get kids in groups for social skills. But what's the danger? What's the best way to teach kids antisocial skills? Get a bunch of kids with ADHD together, right? Oh my God. The eyebrow raising and the sarcasm, and they're modeling for one another. So, some people said about 10 years ago in child psychology and psychiatry, don't do group work with kids with ADHD or kids with aggressive problems. They'll only egg each other on. And then other people said, well, there is that danger, but that's true if the leaders aren't strong and it's just sort of a hangout group. If the leaders, just like a good parent from the slide a few slides ago, have rewards and contingencies and limits, and the kids are really rewarded for paying attention, those social skills groups can help teach social skills. And then the other big trend in this, for grade schoolers, it's harder to do in middle school for obvious reasons, is some of these kids really are shunned. And they really haven't been invited to any more birthday parties. So parents are really coached in friendship coaching and setting up play dates and talking to the other parents about their kid and sort of titrating the kid in social situations. What the studies that have been accumulated for a long time are very clear on is some kids are popular, some are in the middle, and some kids are very unpopular. Kids with ADHD tend to be unpopular for the reasons we talked about. But one good friend can outweigh a lot of pure unpopularity. So if you can build a friendship, it's really important.
I failed to mention he is in middle school.
He is in middle school.
And his closest friend has Asperger's.
Right. So you've got kids, maybe reinforcing some difficult behaviors, but if it's a good quality relationship and he's gaining empathy and he can start to go into wider team sports or clubs and build from strength and move out slowly. That's what you got to do. Right here.
About how
Right, so if ADHD is as heritable, running in the genes as it is, and if almost half the parents of kids with ADHD have the symptoms themselves, whether diagnosed or not, how are you going to expect a parent to do a good job in parent management unless they get their own symptoms treated? So, this is a big debate, but I think there's a lot of legitimacy in top down or bottom up. Maybe if the parent can start to learn to be a better behavior manager, they're going to be calmer in their household too. But maybe they can't begin to do it unless they get medication or cognitive behavioral therapy for themselves. So, if you think there's few enough people doing good child work in the Bay Area, there's fewer doing good adult work, but there are some. So, if the parent really takes care of business, sometimes it's a medication trial for the parent, or sometimes it's a CBT, and there's a little bit more calm base in the house, then that parent management and that consultation with the teachers can go a lot better. Right here.
How come your statement on just in the difference between a child with ADHD or even college, why sister was saying, taking the drugs and the other student that doesn't have it, taking the drugs has such a high rate of breaking bad, so to say.
Right.
Well, what's the difference?
What's the difference? It's a fascinating question, and there's been one study that came out last year that is a clue to this. So this was a big study of not people with ADHD, but a lot of young adults. And it was a genetic study. So there's a certain gene that actually predisposes some people to get ADHD. ADHD is not one gene, it's probably 50 or 100 or 500. But this one gene that predisposes people to get ADHD was studied in several hundred people. And then everybody in the study got a couple of days dose of stimulant as sort of a probe. If you had the gene that predisposes you to get ADHD and you took the stimulant, you got absolutely no buzz at all. You were kind of a little more thoughtful and slightly more dysphoric. If you didn't have that gene, like everybody else, holy shit, where have these stimulants been all my life, right? This is a party drug. So there may be, with ADHD, a bit of an inborn protection against the euphoria that a lot of people get from syndrome. Very good question. Yeah. Right here.
I've read lately just a little bit about slow processing speed associated with ADHD, and from what I've seen, it fits my child exactly. And I'm wondering how it differs, if it differs from regular treatment for
Nobody knows yet. So the term that's been thrown around for a few years is called sluggish cognitive tempo. It's kind of a terrible term. Sluggish, it's very stigmatizing. But we all know people, some kids, they're slow processors. Life is on a 33 and a third record, not a 45. Right? It just doesn't go in as quick. So.
But in the same thing, she's also gifted.
That's right. So, it doesn't mean that you can't learn. You could be genius level IQ with it. But it means that new information is coming in slowly. So, for a while people thought, well, that's just a new name for the inattentive form of ADHD. But it turns out that a lot of people with the inattentive form, they're not very attentive and organized, but they can process information fast. So this slow tempo is sort of a subgroup of a subgroup. No one has the right tools to perfectly identify it yet. It probably, if there's any medication, it would probably not be a stimulant, it would be something else. And it might be that for people, kids like that, you really have to be sure that, what's the usual? I want, as a teacher, read up to page 38, turn your binder into Mage, make sure your locker is cleared out, and we'll see you remember period 2 starts at 3 minutes late tomorrow. And I'm lost on page 38. I'm lost, right? So maybe the auditory cue and the visual cue and on the website and on the board give slow processors a chance to process through different modalities. Who else has an S? Right here. Working memory training. I was talking with the family about this during our fire alarm break. So one of the executive function deficits that a lot of people with ADHD have is this. 6, 9, 7, 4, 8, 2. Could you say those numbers backwards to me? Pretty hard, right? So working memory is holding a bunch of bits of information in your mind and then manipulating it. So it's not just short-term memory, it's like, oh, shit, I got to do it backwards too, right? It's hard. That's a big deficit for many, but not all people with ADHD. So Torkel Klingenberg over in Scandinavian countries, or in Sweden and in Norway, said, we're going to do working memory training for kids with ADHD. We're going to teach them to remember more strings of information. And guess what? They do. And guess what? The recent studies show it doesn't really help with homework or soccer league because kids with ADHD don't remember user strategies outside the class. Because there's motivational issues and executive issues. So it's another promising, it's one piece of a puzzle, but it's not the whole thing. Right here.
Do you have any comments or observations about kids with ADHD when it comes time to drive or
driving in ADHD, move to a state where the mandatory driving age is 18. Saying that tongue-in-cheek, but not really. Graduated driving. Don't have peers in the car for a long time. Whether you've got ADHD or not, really cool. Adolescent research is in driving simulators where there's nobody around, but the kid thinks peers are watching, they're much less safe. Because they're taking dares. That's what adolescents do. And if you've got ADHD, it's worse. What's interesting about ADHD and driving is, well, you think, well, it's the impulsivity, the impulse control. I'm going to run every yellow light in town. But it's also the inattention. It's the lapses. In fact, it's just as much the inattention as it is the impulsivity. If your kid is on medication and does well, they drive on medication. Right? Period. If they're on a behavioral program, there's some sort of chart, try to do a chart. When you're outside the home, have that chart in the car. Don't have them drive with peers for as long as you can, and Kids, remember the 3-year brain delay of the frontal lobes? I mean, if that's really true for at least a subgroup, my cousin back in Ohio, second cousin, his parents gave him ADHD, they let him drive at 16, and the third day he totaled his car on a freeway off-ramp, spun out of control. He was okay because he had a seatbelt on. Russ Barkley, our colleague, ADHD guru, his fraternal twin, stopped taking medication, died in a single-car crash with adult ADHD. It's a tragedy. It's a really serious thing. That's a 3,000-pound weapon. And so Barkley did this study a number of years ago now. How do we really know that ADHD is associated with bad driving? He got when he was a professor at UMass Medical School, he got the DMV in Massachusetts to add an ADHD checklist to the driver's license renewal forms for a year. So they got all the data in the computer base and the ADHD, and there was an almost perfect correlation. That many more ADHD symptoms, 5 times the rate of motor vehicle accidents, speeding tickets, DUIs. But serious business. Now, it is after 8:30. We did have a 14-minute delay. I think we were supposed to end a few minutes ago. Let's go for a few more questions, though, before we all pass out from heat prostration in here. You have that. Can you stand up? It's hard to hear. Teenage girl with? So the reason that the DSM-5 changed from the DSM-4, it said, DSM-4 said, if you don't have any symptoms before 7, you can't have ADHD. There's a lot of kids who don't really show up for middle school, especially girls. If you look back, it's like the rings on a tree, you try hard enough, you're old. But now middle school and all the executive function stuff, and kids get diagnosed late. ADHD is sometimes cool. There's rock songs about ADHD now, go to YouTube. But it's a mental illness, and it's not cool, and the family really has to talk about what it is and what isn't. And there's some pretty good books for teens with ADHD, if you go to the website. Right here.
Is there a correlation between dyslexia and ADHD?
Yes. So, dyslexia, reading disorder, occurs in 5 to 10% of the population. ADHD occurs in 5 to 10%. Probably should be 5, but in America it's over 10. If those, let's say it's 10% of each. If those were 2 unrelated conditions, what would the odds be that you had both? 10% or 10% is 1%. What is the actual overlap? About 25%. So there's 25 times more likelihood that a kid with ADHD will have dyslexia. Probably similar brain regions, maybe early developmental pathways. So now you've got, if you get the motivation up, and medication, so the executive functions and attention better, that still doesn't treat the underlying phonological processing deficit. So you need to go to a reading specialist and get work on that. Classic case of where combination treatments are best. Right? Let's see, who else? Right here. You have next. There are so many books out there, it's hard to choose. So Russ Barkley's Attention Deficit Hyperactivity Disorder, a Handbook for Diagnosis and Treatment. ADHD, a Handbook for Diagnosis and Treatment. 4th edition, just came out in January. 600 pages of small print. But I'll tell you, it is everybody in the world who's an authority on the subtopic has written a chapter in that book. ADHD, a Handbook for Diagnosis and Treatment, Guilford Press, 4th edition, 2015. The ADHD explosion back here is kind of like, what are these new trends? And shamelessly, I just wrote a book that will come out in the fall in the Oxford University Press series. This is a series of books they have called What Everyone Needs to Know. What everyone needs to know about Cuba. What everyone needs to know about the post-communist world. What everyone needs to know about ADHD. So we had 200 pages to say everything I did faster than I talked tonight in that book. ADHD, What Everyone Needs to Know, Oxford Press, September 2015. And there's a jillion other, the best school book is Linda Pfeiffer's book. Linda's our colleague at UC San Francisco. P-F-I-F-F-N-E-R. Looks like Fiffner, but it's Pfeiffer. P-F-I-F-F-N-E-R, Linda. And her book came out in 2013, and it's a book on classrooms and ADHD, and it's called The Classroom Guide. No, it's something like What You Need to Know About Classrooms and ADHD. But look up Pfeiffer. It's a really good book. If you want to get teachers on board with this stuff, it's really good. Right here.
If you come in a school district and you could get them to do one thing to change their policy in the school district to benefit kids with ADHD, what would it be?
If I could do one thing, I would get that school district to find the local community college or a four-year college or whatever, and to get professors at that place to offer course credit, independent work credit, and to get students coming in to help observe, to make an assessment, and as classroom aides. If you have an aide in a classroom, poor teachers these days, their pay sucks. More and more kids, higher and higher standards, and they've got how many kids with ADHD or other learning problems. You get an extra pair of arms and legs and eyes in there, and so this is an aid, not an aid hovering over you with ADHD, it's an aid for the whole class. Then you can implement reward programs much better. This is not rocket science. If we got eager undergrads out there in the classrooms to help with assessment and dispensing of reward programs, we could do a lot better than we do. Now, it's almost 1:15. I do have a Berkeley deadline at 9:30, and it'll be shorter drive back. Linda, you've got the last question.
I want to know if you're running in camps, and if so, how does one?
So our team is not running summer programs now. We're investing all our time in the longitudinal follow-up and the stigma of what we're doing, and my new job at UCSF in integrated psychiatry knowledge and psychiatry, and I don't like to run for-profit camps that cost a lot of money. So there are programs in the area, and I would check the chat. I'm not talking about that. All right, everybody, I'm losing your attention. Thanks a lot.